Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders with Marketing Huddle, and today we have with us Joe Carlen, who is the co-founder of Valuation. Welcome to the program, Joe.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, welcome. So give me a little bit of background on yourself and your entrepreneurial journey, and what inspired you to write a history of entrepreneurship?
Sure. So for over 15 years, I've been working with entrepreneurs, doing everything from business plans to business valuations, which is currently my primary focus at Valueguard's business valuations, and all kinds of other strategic documents and strategic consulting. So in the course of that time, I've worked with so many different entrepreneurs of different industries, and it seemed to me that entrepreneurship itself is a force in life that really has more of an impact than maybe we realize. The purpose of writing this book was to examine historically, what has been the impact of entrepreneurship, not just on the economic sphere, but on other spheres of life. And I believe that during the course of my research, it not only confirmed, but it seemed to me that there was even more of an impact than at least I had realized. So that's what inspired me to write the book.
Yeah, I love that. How deep does that impact go?
Well, it goes as deep as for example, we often think of to take for an example, the wave of colonization that happened beginning really in the 15th century and going into the 19th century. We think of that as, okay, these different governments sort of chartered that, but really to a great extent, especially in the case of the British and the Dutch, much of that was driven by private merchant companies who were actually established by entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs were the investors, and in some cases the governments had very little to do with it. So I think that's an example of something that's really an entrepreneurial project that we don't think of it that way. And I think today the greatest example is what's happening in space tourism, which is now almost entirely driven by entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Richard Branson.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I love when you see the Elon Musk and the Bransons and Peter Diamandis and people like that are really reaching for things that I think that probably if you ask someone right now on the street, they would think it's just far-fetched, right? But then at some point, people didn't think that cars would be something or computers would be something. So what did you find when people, you were interviewing people for your book, where there was maybe a concept like this, like the space program, that, they realized there's something to it, but I can't really grasp it right this minute because it just seems so advanced?
Yeah, I think that's really part of why entrepreneurship is so impactful, is that you have people with a vision that in many cases are contrarian thinkers. Like, they don't really care what other people, what the consensus view is on anything. And certainly Steve Jobs comes to mind. Yeah. And who just press forward with their vision, and at the time it seems far-fetched, and then it becomes a reality. And and that goes all the way back to Mesopotamian merchants setting up trade with the Indus Valley, what's now India. I mean, at that time, that was just as, according to some people, that was just as far-fetched as setting up a hotel on the moon, which there's actually an entrepreneur right now who's working on that.
There literally is. That's a documented story?
Yeah, there's Robert Bigelow he owns Budget Suites, which is a pretty big regional hotel chain, and he's working on habitats, hotels essentially in space, and I believe he has got one in mind in particular for the moon. So these are all these things that just seem absurd. It's not just, especially today when you have these entrepreneurs who are kind of blurring the line between innovator and business person. Many of these advances are entrepreneurial advances.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What was something that surprised you when you were researching and writing the book, that maybe you had one direction you thought it was going to go, but then in research something went completely different? What was that?
Well, I think the most surprising, among the most surprising chapters for me was the one about ancient Rome, because we think of ancient Rome as and it was, in fact, obviously a very powerful economy for a time and whatnot, but it was really interesting how at least the patricians in Rome, the higher classes, how they really shunned entrepreneurship. And it was, I didn't realize to what extent that was true. And the only form of respectable wealth was essentially inheriting it. So it was interesting how, but of course the entrepreneurial work did get done, but it got done by slaves and by people who were slaves would do this kind of work in order to become freedmen. And then, but in some cases, some of these slaves would become free, and they got so good at this entrepreneurial work that in some cases they started things like sort of like chain stores. And the kind of the Walton families of ancient Rome were mainly foreign-born slaves who were despised, but some of them became very, very wealthy. And so that was interesting because I didn't realize that there was this very strange conflicted attitude to entrepreneurial work in ancient Rome. So that was among the more surprising findings.
Yeah, that's I love when I personally like reading books written from the 20s and 30s because it's so interesting to see how foundational truths that we see and hear today are still something from back in that day that nothing much has changed, just maybe the tactics that we use, right? Well, when you find some things that are happening in the Roman culture, well, that's pretty interesting to see, commerce or some of the strategy. And you think some of the even, Socrates and some of the things that they were talking about personally and professionally, how did they have those insights? I think that's really intriguing to me.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of the what Churchill once said: the farther back you can look, the farther ahead you can see. And I think when one learns about the history of entrepreneurship, you see certain patterns recur. And I mean, not just in terms of what are some ingredients of success and failure in entrepreneurship, but also in terms of society's attitudes to entrepreneurship. And it's interesting because there's some very strong parallels between the ancient Roman attitude to entrepreneurship and the attitude to entrepreneurship in the former Soviet Union. So These things, there tends to be these sort of echoes in history.
Yeah, I really love that. History repeats itself, and all the things that we can point to and learn from. I think that's really important. So, who is your book for when someone is hearing about kind of like a history of or an anthology of entrepreneurship? Who is your intended audience? Who do you think will learn the most from it?
Well, I think that entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, I think, would certainly learn from it because, aside from this historical outlook, which I think does have some practical value to absorb that, I think more directly there's plenty of examples of high impact entrepreneurs, not all of whom became wealthy. And I think in that there's, or what most people would call successful, but they were high impact in terms of what they did had a big impact on society in some way. And I think that there certainly are lessons to be gleaned from that. I think a good example is that there are, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, the British Industrial Revolution, there are some. James Watt, for example, is obviously the most famous because we use the unit of energy and everything. But then there's a fellow by the name of Samuel Hargreaves, who is almost forgotten by history, but his innovations were at least as impactful as some of these others who are more well known today. And the reason why he's partly forgotten, and also why he never really became financially successful, had to do with he had a certain naivete about patents, and then there were some other ones who might not have even invented what they claimed to have invented, but they were very aggressive with their patent strategy. So that's just an example of practical lessons that can be gleaned from learning about all these different entrepreneurs throughout history. And I think that the more you see certain trends over time and in different civilizations or different principles, the more likely that those principles are universal and something that are worth learning about.
Yeah, I agree. Is kind of like, not the overview, but is the focus of the book more of a history, chronological history of entrepreneurship, or do you also tie in, and from this, here's takeaways or lessons learned, or do you leave that up to the reader? How did you approach that?
Oh yeah, there are definitely takeaways, and there's actually plenty of references to modern management literature throughout the book. So I'll give you a quick example. Cortez, the colonizer of Mexico, who was absolutely an entrepreneur. I mean, he went there. He burned all the ships once he reached the shore, and said, "I'm going to split the profits with all 600 of you, all the profits that we get from this." And there's actually, he's a good example of someone who he was full of energy, and he accomplished. He got to a certain plateau, and then from that point on, he kind of became too big for his britches. And then there's a management expert who actually discusses Cortez as an example of someone who was a great instigator, but who could not play the game of organizational politics.
And Cortez is the same one that is the famous burn the boats example, right?
Yeah. So there are plenty of, I mean, all these different examples throughout history. There's always ways of drawing parallels, and what can be learned from this, and so that it's always, the emphasis is on what the reader can learn from this, and at the same time the reader's also learning about the history.
You mentioned one of the chapters talking about the emerging space tourism industry. Through your research, did you find any other potential emerging industries that maybe you didn't cover, but you're kind of thinking, here's some things that once the space tourism concept kind of gets fleshed out, here's where some things are heading in addition to that?
I mean, in terms of other industries?
Yeah, what have you heard out there that is similar to the space tourism, like the Elon Musks of the world are focusing on? What else is kind of on the cusp of being talked about?
Well, the reason why I focused on space tourism was that, I mean, certainly in robotics and in the genome mapping and all these things in biotech, there's much of that is driven by entrepreneurship. But the reason why there's special focus on space tourism is that it's kind of like the internet in that the government got the ball rolling, and then the government kind of stepped back, and then all these entrepreneurs, like in the case of the internet, you had especially Mark Andreessen of Netscape, and all these private entrepreneurs came in and then kind of blew it up into something where it became global and everyone has access to it and became a much more powerful tool. So similarly with space tourism, obviously NASA and to some extent the Russian space agency, they got the ball rolling, but then in both cases they for budgetary reasons and whatnot they've kind of retreated, and then now it's really not the government in the driver's seat. It's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and so forth. So that's why space tourism was a particularly kind of potent example of entrepreneurship actually shaping something that's going to have such profound implications for how we live.
Yeah. Hey, so for anyone interested in reading your book, The History of Entrepreneurship, let us know the title and how can people learn more, and what's the link to buy? Sure.
So the title is A Brief History of Entrepreneurship, the Pioneers, Profiteers, and Racketeers Who Shaped Our World. And you can go to value-guards.com. And at value-guards.com, there's a link it says new book. And you can go there and learn more about the book. And then there's also a link to purchase the book there, or you could go to amazon.com and put in my name, Joe Carlen, Carlen.
Well, Joe, thank you for your time. I really enjoyed learning about your new book and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.